Among other things, one of my favorite parts about survival horror games are the puzzles. The anxiety and feeling of dread that you get when you're exploring an eerie mansion or a ghost town, all the while you have to solve a challenging logic puzzle. Yeah, there's no better feeling than that in a survival horror game. So on today's episode of Nerd Space Games, I'm dedicating this video to all of the gamers like me out there that really appreciates a survival horror game that puts us through the ringer with some of the most challenging puzzles ever in a survival horror game. By the way, to keep things interesting and to prevent certain franchises from dominating this list, I'll only be featuring one game per franchise. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is 7 survival horror games with the hardest puzzles. Let's get it. Number 7, Dino Crisis. Considering that we're talking about Capcom here, it shouldn't be too shocking to find Dino Crisis on today's list. While the second game definitely leans farther away from puzzles, the first game has a ton of them, albeit most of them are very similar to each other. I'm of course referring to the DDKs. Essentially, these puzzles are scattered throughout the facility, and you'll need 2 of them of the same letter in order to unlock specific doors. Once you have both keys, you can then head to the door that corresponds with the letter of the keys that you have, in which you'll need to use the keys to encrypt a code that'll give you access to said door. These puzzles change in the way that they work as you get farther into the game, with each one becoming a little more analytical than the last. Some of the later ones specifically can be head scratchers, especially if you start using older methods of solving them for newer keys. Does that make sense? I'm sure some of you guys that play Dino Crisis would know what I mean there. These aren't the only puzzles though, and for some, they are also not the most difficult in the game. For example, the puzzle in which you have to move around large colored pipes was far more challenging for me the first time I attempted it, to the point where I found myself spending about an hour on stream trying to solve it. Yeah, that was pretty embarrassing. Let me know in the chat if you were there for that. Another difficult one involves listening to the sounds of a code being punched in and then recreating that code by the tone of each button. Number 6, Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame is a series that I've only recently explored after I became a content creator about 2 years ago, and since then it's easily become one of my favorite horror franchises. Actually, the first 3 games might very well be one of the best horror trilogies of all time, just behind Silent Hill and Resident Evil. However, if we're talking about puzzle difficulty, none of them really hit the same highs as the first game of the series, Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame is not only full of logic puzzles, but rather environmental puzzles that require you to be aware of your surroundings in order to successfully solve certain puzzles. Just to name a few of the difficult puzzles that really challenge me more than a lot of survival horror games out there include the stone door puzzles, in which you'll need to count counterclockwise based on certain clues given to you in order to solve the puzzle. There's also pentagram puzzles, in which you'll need to move stone tablets around in a set amount of moves to get them to their matching destinations. Environmental puzzles, like the mask puzzle, require you to make your way through a maze by placing and removing different masks to unlock different pathways that allow you to eventually get the main mask that you need to continue on with the game. Yeah, that last one is a bit tricky to explain, honestly. The string of Buddha puzzle is another environmental puzzle that requires you to move around a room and pull different ropes in a specific order to successfully solve this puzzle. Funny enough, Fatal Frame ranges from puzzles that even a child could solve to mind-blowing puzzles that could take ages before you finally realize the trick to solving them without a guide. Number 5, Parasite Eve 2. You would think after playing the first Parasite Eve that the second game really wouldn't have too many difficult puzzles to solve. After all, the first game was more JRPG than survival horror. However, Square Enix had the bright idea to take the franchise in a different direction by making the second installment of the franchise, Parasite Eve 2, more survival horror. And this of course means that you need more difficult puzzles, and man did they deliver in that department. Parasite Eve 2 had a ton of different puzzles, some of which would rival some Resident Evil games actually. The first one that comes to mind is the cash register puzzle inside of the motel. This puzzle literally just left me confused for hours before I was able to solve it. While the clue was relatively straightforward, you need to find paintings to give you a password. Locating the right painting in this hotel was easier said than done. Then you'll need to recognize that you'll need to do a simple math equation in order to find out the number that you need. It sounds simple when you explain it, but for some reason it took me a lot longer than I care to admit. The fireproof safe is another really difficult puzzle, albeit this one was optional I believe, unless you won a pretty useful item. For me, this one was even more difficult than the cash register puzzle, and arguably the hardest puzzle in the game. Essentially, you're solving a 4-part riddle in which each riddle is scattered in different places of dry field, and each of these riddles will reveal to you one of the numbers required to unlock the fireproof safe. These riddles will literally send you all around Dryfield to not only find these riddles, but also count different things scattered throughout the hotel. There's a long list of different puzzles in this game, including slider puzzles and other logic puzzles, but these are the 2 that gave me the most trouble in my first playthrough. Number 4, Song of Horror. Song of Horror is not your typical survival horror game. For the most part, you don't have any weapons or bullets to fight off zombies or other monsters. Instead, you're usually completely defenseless outside of the light source to help you see in the dark and keep the dark entities away. I also want to point out that it's easily the worst experience out of every game on this list. The story is bland and boring, and the lack of combat makes the game feel like a pale imitation of other horror walking simulators, but in third person. With that being said, the one thing that the game does do right are the puzzles. Without a doubt, Song of Horror features some of the most challenging puzzles I've ever encountered in a horror game. In the first chapter of the game alone, I found myself stuck multiple times on different puzzles. The breakbox puzzle, in which you have to use the right amount of volts to turn the power on, was one that took me much longer to complete than I also care to admit. And the dollhouse puzzle is one ongoing puzzle that has so many factors, including using clues to place dolls in the correct rooms and then locate bodies throughout the house before finishing the puzzle using yet another riddle. Other insanely difficult puzzles that come to mind include the library puzzle, the chemistry puzzle, and the plant puzzle in chapter 4. There's a lot more puzzles in this game though that'll challenge your logic and critical thinking skills throughout the game, but these are the first ones to come to mind. Number 3, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. While Resident Evil is famous for the amount of puzzles that you'll come across in almost every single entry, none of them even come close to how difficult RE3 Nemesis is in terms of puzzle difficulty. In fact, at least 3 or even 4 of the puzzles that appear in this game could make a very strong case for being in the top 10 most difficult puzzles of the entire Resident Evil franchise, which is kind of crazy to think about. Starting off with the most famous puzzle in the game, you have the water sample puzzle. To this day, the water sample puzzle continues to confuse new fans of the series that eventually go back and play this game for the first time, to the point where most of those people will end up throwing in the towel and looking at a guide. While it's a logic puzzle, the way to solve it isn't really shown to us in the smoothest way, and some people misunderstand the way you solve it. Check out Ink Ribbon's explanation on how to solve this puzzle because they break it down much better than I ever could. However, the puzzle that gives me a lot more issues than the water sample puzzle ever did is the clocks puzzle in, well, the clock tower. At some point, Jill will come face to face with 3 different clocks. In front of each clock is a scale. The player will also have 3 different rocks to place on these scales, and the objective is to place them in a certain order. Now, I really know that there's a logic to solving this puzzle, but honestly, I've given up trying to understand it, and I just use a process of elimination to solve it. Which I honestly hate because I'm not actually solving the puzzle, but rather guessing until it's right, which is kind of annoying to admit. Anyway, the difficult puzzles don't stop there, as you have the vaccine synthesizer in the hospital to worry about, a music box puzzle, and even the power station to open the 2 shutter doors. Number 2, Tormented Souls. The fact that Tormented Souls is an indie survival horror game inspired by games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, yet it still somehow claims the number 2 spot on today's list, just goes to show how great of a classic survival horror game this game really is. Sure, the combat and the dialogue of the game are far from something to write home about, but the atmosphere, and more importantly for today's video, the puzzles, are easily some of the best in the entire survival horror genre. Tormented Souls isn't afraid to show off the games that inspired it, especially in the puzzle department, as it features both environmental puzzles inspired by Resident Evil and difficult logic puzzles inspired by Silent Hill. My favorite example of an environmental puzzle in this game is the one in which you have to walk around a table with a lighter equipped and the lights off. Sure, it sounds simple when I explain it like that, but to realize that you have to do this, it's actually kind of easier said than done. The game is also full of logic puzzles heavily inspired by Silent Hill. The cash register puzzle requires you to decipher how each image corresponds to different numbers on the cash register. The combination key is a puzzle that's used to unlock multiple doors, with each door having a different clue on it that somehow corresponds to one of the different symbols on your combination key. The TV save, perhaps the most difficult logic puzzle of the game, requires you to figure out each image on the TV corresponds to a different number, and you'll need to unlock the save using the knob on the TV. And finally, for those of you that might not be musically inclined like myself, you might find the record player to be one of the more difficult puzzles of the game, as you'll need to recreate the sound you hear from a song playing nearby in order to successfully complete this puzzle. Number 1, Silent Hill 3. It was extremely tough to decide which survival horror game should claim the title of survival horror game with the hardest puzzles in it, for multiple reasons. For one, Silent Hill 3 and Tormented Souls are both very difficult in terms of the puzzles in each of their respective games. And 2, Silent Hill 2, both the remake and the original game, both make a strong argument for being here over Silent Hill 3 due to how difficult the puzzles are in those games as well. Ultimately though, I just couldn't pull myself away from the fact that Silent Hill 3 stumped me more than any other survival horror game in terms of the puzzles. One of which was borderline impossible to solve unless you were familiar with Shakespeare, which, for the record, I'm not. Speaking of which, I should note that I'm looking at this game from the hardest puzzle difficulty because obviously on easier difficulties, these puzzles are literally child's play. Anyway, back to that dreaded bookstore puzzle, it is without a doubt the hardest puzzle I've ever come across in a survival horror game. See, in order to solve this puzzle, you'll need to at least have some basic knowledge of some of Shakespeare's greatest works, like Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet. However, on top of having this knowledge, you'll also need to be able to decipher exactly what the riddle is telling you to do before you can arrange the books in the right order and get the code that you need to move on. I'll stop there because I can spend an entire video just talking about this puzzle alone. However, there are plenty of other puzzles I want to briefly mention that are just bonkers to solve in this game. The Brookhaven keypad, for example, requires you to imagine that the keypad is a person's face, and in order to unlock the door, you'll need to read a very disturbing poem to decipher what buttons to push and in what order. And the last one that I'll mention is the crematorium puzzle, in which you'll need to use a poem to discover a few of the digits of a code while also paying close attention to a phone call you heard outside of the room in order to get the final digit. Peachy. And don't worry, this list doesn't even begin to cover all the different difficult puzzles that you'll encounter in this game alone. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Silent Hill 3 the most difficult survival horror game when it comes to the puzzles? Are there any other survival horror games that you can think of that deserve to be on today's list? Let me know your opinions in the comments down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.